Woodruff, South Carolina, Sunday, October 9th, 2011, 11:30 a.m. 48-year-old landscaper Scott Davis is on the computer searching Craigslist employment ads.
Davis comes across a posting for an on-site caretaker position at a cattle farm in Ohio, which happens to be close to where his sick mother lives.
The job offers $300 a week and a 2-bedroom trailer to live in, which is tailor-made for Davis's situation.
Davis responds to the email address associated with the ad.
Several days later, Scott receives a response from a man named Jack.
Davis is offered the job sight unseen. He's told that it would be a plus if he can bring his own truck and equipment with him.
On November 5th, Scott packs up all of his belongings, including a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and hits the road. Marietta, Ohio, Sunday, November 6th, 2011, 9:40 a.m. Scott Davis arrives at Shoney's Diner. He meets with his new employer, Jack, who's brought along a teenager named Brogan, who he says is his nephew.
They discuss the caretaker job over breakfast, and then they all go out to Scott's truck to inventory his belongings.
The trio gets in Brogan's Buick and heads out to rural Caldwell, Ohio.
As they near the farm, Jack explains that he needs to retrieve some equipment that he's hidden in the woods. He tells Brogan to pull over.
Brogan stays behind at the car as Jack and Scott disappear into the woods.
They don't find any equipment, so Jack suggests they take another route.
Scott turns to look in the other direction, and as soon as he does, Jack walks up behind him.
All of a sudden, Scott hears the loud click of a gun cocking.
Scott Davis swings around and finds himself staring down the barrel of a gun.
Instinctively, he covers his face with his hands. Jack shoots, but the gun misfires, clipping Scott in the elbow instead of the head.
Davis takes off running. Jack chases after him, firing the gun repeatedly.
He manages to cross a road into another set of woods and finds a good hiding spot in the underbrush near a creek.
He remains in that spot until sunset.
Around 7:30 that night, after walking for miles, Scott sees a house with its lights on. He rings the doorbell in a panic.
Sheriff Hanum's office.
Hey, yes, we just had a gentleman come up to our front door. He claims that he's been shot. He's got some blood on him. What's your name, sir? Scott Davis. Sir, do you need an ambulance or anything right now? Or you need
Please come pick me up.
Yeah, so if you can have somebody come up here ASAP.
The Noble County Sheriff Stephen Hanum arrives on the scene. He photographs Davis' injuries, then listens to a story about the man named Jack who hired him to take care of his 688-acre farm.
Sheriff Hanum finds Davis' story a little fishy. The likelier story in the sheriff's mind is that Scott was involved in a drug deal gone bad.
The sheriff knows the area where Davis claims he was attacked is part of land owned by local biker Jerry Hood Sr., who's suspected of having drug connections.
Davis is taken to Akron General Medical Center, where he'll spend the next 5 days recovering from surgery on his arm. In the meantime, Sheriff Hanum attempts to verify Davis's unbelievable story.
The sheriff learns that the U.S. Marshals have Jerry Hood Sr.'s farm under surveillance, believing that one of Hood's known associates, Richard Beasley, might be staying there. There's an arrest warrant out for Beasley because of a parole violation.
The day after the shooting, Monday, November 7th, the Noble County Sheriffs obtained security footage from Shoney's.
In the footage, it's clear that Scott Davis is with a heavy-set white male and a younger white male who match his descriptions of Jack and his nephew Brogan.
The next day, Detective Jason Mackey and an agent from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation visit the area on Don Warner Road, where Scott Davis claims he was ambushed.
They find Davis's hat in a stream, which further corroborates his account. At this point, they contact the local FBI field office and ask for further assistance in the investigation.
As soon as Davis is released from the hospital on November 10th, he meets with FBI agents in Akron.
The agents show Scott a bunch of photographs. Davis can't identify the older man, but he positively IDs the teenager, a 16-year-old named Brogan Rafferty.
Caldwell, Ohio, Friday, November 11th, 2011, 4 p.m. Detective Mackey receives a call from a woman named Deborah Bruce. She tells him her twin brother, David Paulie, is missing.
According to Deborah, her brother just landed a job via Craigslist as a caretaker for a cattle farm in rural Ohio.
Deborah tells Detective Mackey that 3 weeks earlier, on October 22nd, David rented a U-Haul in Virginia, packed up all his possessions, and made the drive to Caldwell.
She explains that David called her from the road, and that was the last time she'd heard from him.
The U-Haul was returned 2 days later, but not by David Paulie.
She's bringing her brother up to Noble County's attention now because she came across a story about Scott Davis, who'd accepted a similar Ohio caretaker job to her brother's.
Deborah forwards a series of email exchanges between her brother and his new employer Jack to Detective Mackey.
An FBI cybercrime specialist looks at the Craigslist ads and discovers that Scott Davis and David Paulie both responded to Jack's ad on October 9th. The following day, October 10th, 2 other men responded, Dan DeWalt and Timothy Kern.
All of the Craigslist ads were posted from the same IP address, which is associated with a man named Joe Bias who lives in Akron, Ohio.
Akron, Ohio, Monday, November 14th, 2011. FBI agents visit Joe Bias at home to question him about the Craigslist ads.
Bias informs investigators that back in August, he rented a room to a man named Ralph Geiger, whose nickname is Dutch. Bias says Dutch often used his laptops at the house. According to Bias, Dutch wanted another laptop from him. Because he was short on cash, Dutch traded Bias a bunch of random objects for it: ammo cases, Christmas lights, and a train.
Some of the items appear to belong to David Paulie.
Investigators ask Bias to ID his one-time lodger from a series of photos.
Bias picks the picture of the man he thinks is Ralph Geiger, aka Dutch, but he's actually identifying an ex-convict named Richard Beasley.
Richard Beasley's the fugitive U.S. Marshals believe might be hiding out at Jerry Hood Sr.'s farm.
Bias calls Richard Beasley at the authorities' request.
He manages to keep Beasley on the phone long enough for law enforcement to trace him to a home on Gridley Avenue in Akron.
Later that day, detectives talk to Richard Beasley's ex-wife, Tina.
Tina deeply fears Richard, who used to threaten to kill her, then bury her body on Jerry Hood's farm, where she'd never be found.
Investigators show Tina a picture from the Shoney's surveillance tape. She positively identifies her ex. Authorities are now certain that Scott Davis's Jack and Joe Bias's Ralph Geiger are without a doubt ex-con Richard Beasley.
In November 2011, 48-year-old Scott Davis is shot and chased through the woods of rural Ohio by a man who lured him there via Craigslist with a job prospect. Authorities quickly learned that 3 weeks earlier, 51-year-old David Paulie went missing after he responded to a Craigslist ad.
With the FBI's help, the Noble County sheriffs now know that Scott Davis and David Paulie responded to the same ad, which had been posted by ex-con Richard Beasley.
Caldwell, Ohio, Monday, November 14th, 2011. A team of law enforcement officials returned to the area on Don Warner Road where Scott Davis was attacked.
They find 3 hand-dug holes. One is several feet deep and approximately 80 inches long, roughly the size of a grave.
The following day, officers return to the scene with cadaver dogs who find a shallow grave. They excavate the area and unearth the decomposed remains of a white male.
A piece of jewelry found on the body belongs to missing person David Paulie. An autopsy confirms Paulie's identity and reveals that he died from a gunshot wound to the head 2 to 3 weeks earlier.
Now, with a homicide on their hands, investigators re-interview Richard Beasley's ex-wife, Tina.
Tina confirms that Richard and 16-year-old Brogan Rafferty have a close relationship. She also mentions that Richard used to steal people's driver's licenses and reapply for new social security numbers. This suggests identity theft may have been the motive behind David Paulie's murder.
Akron, Ohio, Wednesday, November 16th, 2011. A SWAT team descends on the address where the FBI geolocated Richard Beasley. They take him into custody without incident.
Investigators search the room that Beasley's renting and find several items belonging to David Paulie. They also find documents and prescription bottles, all in the name of Ralph Geiger.
Stowe, Ohio, Wednesday, November 16th, 2011. FBI agents execute a search warrant on the home of 16-year-old Brogan Rafferty, Richard Beasley's supposed accomplice.
They find a briefcase containing a .22 caliber Iver Johnson pistol, items belonging to David Paulie, and a poem written by Brogan on his computer that appears to chronicle the death of the real Ralph Geiger.
Simultaneously, officers arrive at Stowe Monroe Falls High School and take Rafferty into custody. They drive him home so he can be questioned in the presence of his parents.
Brogan readily admits to meeting David Paulie and Scott Davis, but denies involvement in anything that happened in the woods.
The agents confront Rafferty with a picture of a pre-dug makeshift grave, which Richard Beasley, who'd been disabled in a car accident, most likely could not have dug himself. Rafferty then admits that he dug the hole at Beasley's command, but didn't know what it was for.
The authorities believe there's much more to the story than Rafferty's telling them, so they arrest him and take him to the local jail.
Noble County Sheriff's Office, Thursday, November 17th, 2011, 8:55 a.m. Detective Jason Mackey interviews Brogan Rafferty.
After Mackey confronts Rafferty with the evidence they have against him, Brogan admits to being more involved in the crimes against Scott Davis and David Paulie.
Brutal honesty is all we can ask, okay? When Mr. Paulie was shot, were you present?
No, sir.
Did you help put him in the hole or cover him up?
I put him in the hole, or helped put him in the hole.
In mid-November 2011, 52-year-old ex-con Richard Beasley and his 16-year-old sidekick Brogan Rafferty are arrested for the murder of David Paulie and the attempted murder of Scott Davis. Authorities allege that Beasley posted a bogus job listing on Craigslist to lure both men to southeastern Ohio so he could rob them of their possessions and potentially steal their identities.
Police discovered there were two other men who responded to Beasley's Craigslist ad, Dan DeWalt and Tim Kern. They interviewed DeWalt but have been unable to locate Kern.
Finally, on November 20th, Tina Kern contacts the FBI and tells them that her ex-husband Tim has been missing for about a week.
Tina explains that Tim had been unemployed and often used her computer to look for work. While doing so, he came across a great opportunity online.
According to Tina, Tim told her he went to a Waffle House in Akron, Ohio on November 7th to meet a prospective employer named Ron.
Apparently, Ron offered Tim the job, but one of the conditions was that Tim transfer the title of his car over to him.
On the night of November 12th, Tim Kern visited his ex-wife and their sons before heading off to his new job. That was the last time he'd been seen by his family. Law enforcement is building strong cases against Beasley for the Davis, Paulie, and Kern incidents, but they need Brogan Rafferty's cooperation to bring it home.
Investigators offer Rafferty a deal if he agrees to tell them everything and testifies against Richard Beasley in open court.
Caldwell, Ohio, Wednesday, November 23rd, 2011, 11 a.m. Brogan Rafferty gives a taped confession to Noble County Sheriff's detectives.
Rafferty starts by telling detectives about the real Ralph Geiger. Back in August 2011, Richard Beasley, who'd been in prison on drug and prostitution charges, got out on bond. Fearing that he'd be sent back to jail, Beasley wanted a new identity. Geiger looked similar enough to fit the bill.
Geiger was living in a homeless shelter when Beasley offered him a job that he believed would put him back on his feet.
Beasley and Geiger met at the Best Western in Caldwell on Monday, August 8th, 2011.
The following morning, Beasley takes Geiger into the woods and shoots him.
Mr. Beasley pulled a pistol out and pointed it at the back of Mr. Geiger's head. I closed my eyes and then I heard a gunshot and I opened them. Mr. Geiger was in the creek bed.
Did he seem to be dead?
Yes, he was dead. I'm pretty sure.
Rafferty helps dig a grave and tosses Geiger's body into it. Before they bury Geiger, they steal his identifying documents.
10 weeks later, on October 23rd, Beasley and Rafferty dig a hole off Don Warner Road, then meet up with David Paulie for breakfast.
Rafferty explains that once they got Paulie out in a remote wooded area, he left to use the bathroom. Then he heard a loud crack and saw Paulie fall down dead.
Rafferty claims he and Beasley buried Paulie in the pre-dug hole. According to Rafferty, by the time they set up Scott Davis, he's fully aware that Beasley's soliciting people on Craigslist with fake job offers.
Apparently, Beasley believes Scott Davis was the ultimate mark.
Beasley was excited because it was supposed to be a pretty big load of stuff. I think there was supposed to be a motorcycle, and we had a lot of his equipment with him. It was going to be worth some money.
How much money do you think it was worth, Beasley?
I think he said something like $30,000.
According to Rafferty, Beasley's final target, Tim Kern, didn't have much. A car on its last legs, an old TV, and $5 in cash. But Beasley decides to move forward regardless.
Rafferty says he and Beasley met Tim at Italo's Pizza in Canton. They left Kern's car there and drove together out to the farm.
I heard a pop, and I turn around, and Mr. Kern is on his knees, kind of holding the side of his head. And Beasley is saying to him, "Are you all right?" And then Kern doesn't respond.
Beasley then shot Kern several more times.
I think he shot him 3 times in the head, but there was something wrong with the gun. So Beasley went up and got the gun close to him, and I turned around because I didn't want to see him, and he shot him again.
On November 25th, 2 days after Brogan Rafferty's confession, investigators returned to Don Warner Road.
About 150 feet from where they originally found Scott Davis's hat, authorities dig up a body that has a gunshot wound to the back of the head.
Dental records confirm it's Ralph Geiger.
Now that Beasley's first victim has been found, police focus on finding his last, Tim Kern.
Crime scene investigators search the woods behind the Rolling Acres Mall. They find a shallow grave with Tim Kern's body inside.
By late November 2011, police in southeastern Ohio have finally found the bodies of Ralph Geiger, David Paulie, and Tim Kern, who were all shot to death by 52-year-old ex-con Richard Beasley. Investigators have a full-tape confession from Beasley's 16-year-old accomplice, Brogan Rafferty, outlining exactly how the murders went down. Yet, that December, Rafferty's plea deal falls apart.
On December 15, 2011, the court decides to try Brogan Rafferty as an adult. He's charged with aggravated murder, attempted murder, and a multitude of other charges.
1 month later, in January 2012, a grand jury indicts Richard Beasley for the murders of Ralph Geiger, David Paulie, and Timothy Kern, as well as the attempted murder of Scott Davis.
Beasley pleads not guilty to all the charges.
Who exactly is Richard Beasley?
Richard Beasley is born in 1959. He grows up with a religious mother. Beasley's apparently abused by his stepfather and bullied by kids in the neighborhood. By the mid-'80s, Richard's committing burglaries and having multiple run-ins with the law. He's incarcerated in Texas State Prison from 1985 to 1990, then federal prison from 1996 to 2003.
In 2004, Beasley reconnects with religion.
He moves to Ohio and becomes a street preacher known as Chaplain Rich, but remains involved in the Brothers Motorcycle Club. That's how he becomes acquainted with Mike Rafferty, who runs with a rival club.
Mike's son Brogan is about 8 when he expresses an interest in going to church. So Mike sends him with Richard Beasley.
Brogan gravitates to Beasley.
After a debilitating car accident, Beasley becomes dependent on painkillers. In 2009, he takes his financial settlement from the accident and opens up a halfway house.
But soon, Beasley allegedly prostitutes some of the female residents and deals illegal drugs.
Beasley's arrested yet again in February of 2011. He's released on bond in July, but the state of Texas files a warrant against him for a parole violation.
Beasley makes plans to go on the run, but needs a new identity. That's when he implores his protege Brogan to help him steal Ralph Geiger's identity.
Summit County, Ohio. Friday, October 12, 2012. The Brogan Rafferty trial gets underway at the Common Pleas Court.
Rafferty is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Summit County, Ohio. Monday, February 25, 2013. Richard Beasley stands trial.
The defense only calls 4 witnesses to the stand, including Richard Beasley himself.
Beasley doesn't admit to killing anyone.
On March 13, 2013, Richard Beasley is convicted of aggravated murder, attempted murder, and over 20 additional charges. A month later, the judge sentences Beasley to death.
Richard Beasley is to greed what Charles Manson is to insanity. He horribly manipulated Brogan Rafferty into doing his bidding. And Brogan Rafferty appears to be just a victim of his malice and callousness.
Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, 6 p.m. 53-year-old Rabbi Fred Neulander shares a pizza dinner with his 21-year-old son, Matthew. His wife won't be home till late, and their other 2 children, Rebecca and Ben, live out of town.
The Neulanders are a successful upper-middle-class family. Rabbi Neulander draws a 6-figure salary from nearby Makor Shalom Synagogue, which he founded.
52-year-old Carol Neulander founded her own company, a bakery called Classic Cakes, back in 1990. She later sold the company, but returned to manage it.
That night, Carol is actually attending an after-hours staff meeting.
At 6:45 p.m., Matthew Neulander heads to a local ambulance company for his 12-hour EMT shift.
Fred changes into a suit and heads to McCore Shalom to check in on the night's activities. The week prior was the first time in a year that Neulander had taken a renewed interest in attending Tuesday night classes.
Fred spends nearly 2 hours at the synagogue.
Rabbi Neulander leaves the temple at 8:50 p.m. He pulls into his driveway at 9:19.
As soon as the rabbi opens the front door, he notices 2 spots of blood on the hardwood floor.
Neulander follows the blood trail. At the end of it, he finds Carol, his wife of nearly 29 years, lying face down on the living room floor.
It appears that Carol has been savagely beaten. Instead of rendering assistance to his wife, Rabbi Fred immediately picks up a cordless phone and dials 911.
I just came home. My wife is on the floor, and there's blood all over her. I don't know what to do.
Matthew, who's on duty, recognizes his home address as the call comes out over the radio. He races home.
First responders from the Cherry Hill Police Department and Camden County Prosecutor's Office show up at 9:30.
They locate Fred by the garage, but he isn't crying and doesn't appear to be too distressed.
One of the officers enters the house.
He finds Carol's severely battered body on the floor. It's obvious she's dead, so the officer tapes the area to secure the homicide scene.
He conducts an initial walkthrough of the home, but doesn't find any signs of forced entry.
Matthew Neulander arrives within minutes. When police don't allow him to enter the house, his EMT friends have to physically restrain him.
Matthew soon realizes that the reason he's not allowed inside is because his mother is dead. Overcome with grief, he walks away. Fred does not follow or attempt to comfort his son.
Fred calls his 24-year-old daughter Rebecca, who lives 20 minutes away in Philadelphia.
Fred tells his daughter there's been an accident. He never says what kind of accident, but Rebecca figures it out during the ride home, that her mother is dead, and she's devastated.
Fred also makes arrangements for his youngest son, 19-year-old Ben, to fly home from Michigan, where he's attending college.
Word spreads quickly among the congregants of McCore Shalom that Rabbi Neulander's wife has possibly been murdered.
Neulander's closest friends come by that night to offer sympathy. Because police aren't allowing anyone inside the residence, they gather together inside the paramedic van.
While the friends are shaking and traumatized, Fred still appears very calm. One of the women asks him what he thinks happened. Fred makes the offhanded comment that it was the Colombians at the bakery.
Fred implies that Carol had been killed during a robbery, and she shouldn't have been carrying so much money home from the bakery in her purse.
As soon as Rebecca arrives from Philly, she gets into the EMT van with her father, brother, and an investigator from the Camden County Prosecutor's Office.
Rebecca tells the investigator that exactly 1 week prior, a man came over to the house claiming to have a package to deliver to Fred. The man asked to use the bathroom and then left. Rebecca and her mother subsequently named the visitor the bathroom man.
Rebecca explains that she'd been on the phone with her mother earlier that night when the bathroom man showed up again. According to what Rebecca could hear, her mother apparently invited the man inside again, although this time it seemed like he was accompanied by another person.
Cherry Hill Police Department, Wednesday, November 2nd, 1994, 1 a.m. Fred, Matthew, and Rebecca Neulander arrive at the station house for questioning.
Detectives speak with Rebecca first, then Matt.
Investigators finally sit down with Fred Neulander at 3:20 a.m.
The rabbi has nothing but positive things to say about his relationship with his wife.
Fred volunteers that there's never been any infidelity on either side and that they've never been to marriage counseling. He also declares that there's absolutely no ongoing hostility between himself and his wife.
Yet, during his interview, Matthew indicated that his parents recently got into an intense argument.
Matthew tells detectives that just 2 nights prior, his parents stormed into the house together at 10 o'clock. His mother then told him to say goodbye to his father because Fred was going to be moving out of the house for good.
At one point, Carol turned to Fred and asked if he wanted to work things out or end the marriage. Fred apparently replied, "It's over." According to Matthew, his mother then grabbed some suitcases, threw them at his father, and told Fred to get out.
A few hours later, it appeared as though the argument had blown over, which left Matthew completely dumbfounded.
During their Q&A with Rebecca, detectives learned additional details about the so-called bathroom man.
Rebecca explains that on the night of October 25th, She was chatting on the phone with her mother as Carol drove home from her usual Tuesday after-hours staff meeting at the bakery.
That night, after Carol pulled into the driveway, she remained in the car for a moment to finish the call when a man tapped on the window.
According to Rebecca, her mother believed that it was a delivery man Fred had told her would be stopping by the house to drop something off. Rebecca asked her mom if she wanted to stay on the phone, but her mother had said it's fine and hung up the car phone to go inside.
As it was cold outside and Fred wasn't yet home, Carol had invited the man into their house. Once inside, the man had asked to use the bathroom.
Rebecca tells the investigators that after the guy left, her mother called back and told her the man left behind an open envelope that night, but there was nothing inside.
Rebecca was instantly suspicious when the bathroom guy showed up again earlier that evening. She also really didn't like the fact that her mother invited him inside the house again, especially considering there was another person with him. She'd heard her mother tell the bathroom man to invite his friend in because it was cold outside.
Detectives had asked Fred Neulander if he'd been expecting a visitor either of the past 2 Tuesdays, as Rebecca had told them.
Fred tells police he never told Carol to expect any delivery or delivery person the previous Tuesday, though he claims Carol told him after the fact that a man had come over.
On November 1st, 1994, New Jersey Rabbi Fred Neulander arrives home to find his wife Carol bludgeoned to death on their living room floor. Fred, who's oddly cool and collected in the aftermath of the murder, puts forward the theory that his wife had been killed in a botched robbery. During their search of the Neulanders' residence, police were able to determine that Carol's burgundy purse is missing.
Investigators speak with several employees from Classic Cakes to determine if, like Fred Neulander suggested, one of them might have killed Carol in a robbery attempt. None of the staff seems particularly suspicious.
On Thursday, November 3rd, the Neulanders begin observing Shiva, the traditional Jewish period of mourning following a familial death.
They receive hundreds of visitors. Many of these guests notice that instead of exhibiting intense grief, Fred appears to be upbeat. Neulander apparently cracks jokes and tells friends that the police will never find out who killed Carol.
In the meantime, the Cherry Hill police take a closer look at the Neulanders' marriage.
Police also receive a few anonymous phone calls alleging that the good rabbi is having multiple affairs, including that he's recently been involved with Philadelphia radio host Elaine Sonsini.
Detectives pull Neulander's phone records in mid-November and confirm that he called Sonsini numerous times, including the day after his wife's murder.
They stake out Sonsini's house. Eventually, they record Rabbi Neulander pulling his car into her garage.
Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Monday, December 5th, 1994. Detectives interview Elaine Sonsini at the police station.
Sonsini outright denies having an affair with Fred Neulander. She claims they met in December of 1992 when her husband, Ken, was dying of leukemia, and the rabbi grief counseled her at the hospital.
The detectives confront Sonsini with the phone records. Sonsini sticks to her denial and is allowed to leave the station.
Yet, the following morning, Sonsini decides she wants to speak to police again.
This time, Elaine admits that she and Fred Neulander were having an affair. Apparently, less than a week after her husband's death, Neulander asked her out to lunch and kissed her. 3 days after that, they got even more intimate.
Apparently, after just 3 months, the rabbi declared his love for Elaine and told her he planned on divorcing his wife.
During the summer of 1994, after more than a year of sneaking around, she gave Fred an ultimatum. They needed to be together for real by January 1st, 1995, or she planned to move on. Neulander allegedly promised they'd be together by her birthday, December 17th.
According to Sonsini, Neulander told her he had a premonition his wife would be a victim of violence. Then, just weeks before the murder, Fred casually told Elaine that he wished Carol would just vanish and that maybe her car could just go into the river.
Sonsini leaves investigators with one final morsel, that Rabbi Neulander proposed to her just after the family finished observing Shiva. She balked.
Elaine ends up telling Neulander to stop. She ends up in a relationship with a Cherry Hill police officer assigned to protect her from him.
In January 1995, detectives convince Sonsini to call Neulander while they listen in.
Police record the eventual phone conversation between Sonsini and Neulander. She repeatedly tries to get him to confess that he killed Carol, but he fervently denies anything to do with her death.
By late January 1995, nearly 3 months after Carol Neulander is savagely beaten to death in her home, police in Cherry Hill, New Jersey are investigating her husband, Rabbi Fred Neulander, as a person of interest. After questioning Neulander's longtime mistress, Elaine Sonsini, detectives learned the rabbi made some disturbing comments prior to his wife's death about wishing she was dead and gone. In the spring of 1995, after the tabloids highlight Rabbi Neulander's extramarital indiscretions, a man named Myron Pepe Levin contacts police.
Pepe and Fred Neulander played racquetball together. According to Pepe, Fred shamelessly discussed his affairs and told him he was contemplating a divorce from Carol.
In September 1994, 1 month before Carol's murder, Pepe claims Fred got angry after a racquetball match and told him he wished he could come home and find Carol dead on the floor, and casually said, "Maybe you could help me do it."
Soon, law enforcement turns their attention to a man named Len Genoff, a low-level private eye Fred Neulander hired to solve his wife's murder.
Genoff was living in a halfway house in the spring of 1993 when he met Neulander while attending AA meetings at the Makor Shalom Temple.
Detectives wonder why the rabbi would hire someone who seems professionally unequipped and who has a reputation around Cherry Hill as a drunk.
Law enforcement continues to investigate a possible Genoff connection. By the end of 1997, homicide detectives remain convinced that Fred Neulander orchestrated his wife's death. Camden County, New Jersey, Thursday, September 10, 1998, 9:15 a.m. Cherry Hill police pull over Fred Neulander and arrest him.
Police take him to the Camden County Jail, where he's held on suspicion of first-degree murder. He pleads not guilty at his arraignment, posts a $400,000 bail, and returns home to lay low during the lead-up to trial.
In late April 2000, just 2 months prior to trial, the Camden County Prosecutor's Office gets an unexpected call from a reporter.
Nancy Phillips, who works for the Philadelphia Inquirer, tells District Attorney Lee Solomon that she wants to meet with him and the lead investigator on the Neulander case, Marty Devlin.
On April 28th, Devlin and Solomon meet Phillips at a diner in Audubon, New Jersey.
To their surprise, Phillips brings Len Genoff with her.
Phillips tells the two detectives that Genoff had given her the untold story of what actually happened to Carol Neulander on the night of November 1st, 1994.
Genoff admits that he killed Carol on orders from Rabbi Fred Neulander.
Genoff explains that back in the spring of 1994, the rabbi told him there was an enemy of the state of Israel living in Cherry Hill who needed to be taken out.
Genoff agreed to help get rid of this person, a woman, because he felt like he owed the rabbi. Yet, he claims he never knew the woman was Neulander's wife.
Genoff says Rabbi Fred offered to pay him $30,000 for the hit.
Throughout the spring of 1994, Genoff and Neulander discussed how to kill Carol.
Fred ultimately concludes that they should make the murder look like a botched robbery.
Genoff was originally supposed to kill Carol Neulander on October 25th, but once Carol invited him inside the house, he couldn't find her purse. Fred had insisted that Genoff steal his wife's purse to make the robbery ploy look authentic.
Genoff ended up using the bathroom in an attempt to look for the purse, but came up empty and ultimately left the house. Detectives now know that Len Genoff is the infamous bathroom guy.
Neulander, who'd already paid Genoff $7,500, was apparently furious when the two men met the following day.
It's at this point that Genoff says he enlisted the help of his roommate, 21-year-old Paul Michael Daniels. Daniels had a drug problem, and he was willing to help kill Carol for the money.
On Tuesday, November 1st, the two men go to the Neulander residence. Carol lets them in, but is talking on the phone. Genoff explains that once Carol gets off the call, Daniels hit her in the head once with a section of a lead pipe.
Afterward, Genoff met up with Daniels in a nearby parking lot. There, Daniels handed him a duffel bag containing the lead pipe, Carol's burgundy purse, and a windbreaker covered in blood.
Genoff says Neulander paid him another $7,500 a couple days later. He also explains the sole reason the rabbi hired him to be a private investigator was to launder the balance of the $30,000 contract.
Genoff and Daniels are subsequently arrested for the murder of Carol Neulander.
By May 2000, 5.5 years after Carol Neulander was savagely murdered in her New Jersey home, police have charged 3 suspects: private investigator Len Genoff, Genoff's roommate Paul Daniels, and Carol's own husband, Rabbi Fred Neulander. Under questioning, Genoff and Daniels confessed that they beat Carol to death on the rabbi's orders in exchange for money.
Len Genoff provides police with an 89-page statement laying out the murder-for-hire plot.
Genoff also alleges that Rabbi Neulander drew him a map of the house so he'd know exactly where to attack Carol, and put a dead bulb in the front porch light so it would be dark when the hit went down.
That June, Len Genoff strikes a deal with the Camden County Prosecutor's Office.
In exchange for his cooperation and a guilty plea, the charges against him are reduced from murder to aggravated manslaughter.
Paul Daniels makes the same deal with the DA, yet because he took Carol's burgundy purse, he's also charged with robbery.
On June 22nd, Rabbi Fred Neulander is re-indicted on charges of capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. A judge revokes his bail and he's sent to Camden County Correctional Facility.
Just who exactly is the disgraced rabbi who's accused of masterminding the murder of his wife?
Fred Neulander is born in Queens, New York in 1941. Friends from high school remember him as charming, but possibly ashamed of his middle-class upbringing.
In 1962, while majoring in religious studies at Trinity College, Neulander meets Carol Litz. 3 years later, in December 1965, they marry.
The Neulanders have their third child by 1974. The same year, Fred and a friend decide to open their own Reform temple in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Makor Shalom.
In 1980, Carol opens her first Classic Cakes retail shop.
Within a couple years, Classic Cakes is making millions per year.
Carol sells the company, but stays on as a salaried employee. Naively, she brings home upwards of $15,000 to $20,000 in cash in her burgundy purse, which she counts on the kitchen table.
Fred's aware of his wife's money-counting ritual, which leads him to believe that by staging a botched robbery, he could get away with murder.
Camden, New Jersey, Tuesday, October 16th, 2001. The murder trial of Fred Neulander gets underway at the County Hall of Justice. Neulander's former mistress, Elaine Sonsini, as well as Len Genoff and Paul Daniels testify for the state. The rabbi does take the stand in his own defense.
Neulander testifies that he had nothing to do with the murder of his wife. He does admit that he had extramarital relationships, but qualifies it by claiming that he and Carol had an open marriage.
After several days of deliberations, the jurors are unable to reach a unanimous verdict. On November 13th, 2001, the judge declares a mistrial.
Freehold, New Jersey, Wednesday, November 20th, 2002. After a month-long retrial, a Monmouth County jury convicts Rabbi Fred Neulander on 3 counts: capital murder, felony murder, and second-degree conspiracy to commit murder.
In January 2003, Neulander is sentenced to life in prison. Later that same month, Len Genoff and Paul Daniels are both sentenced to 23 years in prison with parole eligibility after 10 years served.
Fred Neulander is someone who always craved having more power, and one way to achieve this power was by being a religious leader. By being a rabbi, he could get people to respect him, listen to him, and to kill his wife.